So that crackling sound is actually the vaporization of water, and when that happens, basically ruptures the oil film and sends oil droplets flying everywhere. So you'll see if you remove the pan, you'll get a nice ring of oil droplets, and some of them hit your arm, and normally you're cursing when that happens, because it's actually quite painful.
After this explosion, there are often water droplets in the oil droplets in the air, and then they'll sometimes explode too. So you get these beautiful jets, like just mid-air.
Yeah.
Which is really, I know it's gorgeous.
We wanted to understand exactly what was going on in that process. So we just have a mini frying pan, which is about an aluminium plate or steel plate about that big, and it has a little well that we put the oil in, and we just let that heat up, and we measure the temperature with the thermocouple. So we know exactly what the temperature is. So it's not just low, medium, or high. We know exactly what the oil temperature really is, and then we film it with the high-speed camera and do the aerosol sizing measurements. When these droplets fly out, you get some of the ones that hit your skin, probably millimetric in size. But it's the other stuff that you don't see and you don't feel, which we think is potentially hazardous and adding to indoor air pollution. Anything less than 2.5 microns in size is respirable and can go down to the lower branches of the lungs. Some of these are down to sub-microns, so they're hundreds of nanometers in size. That's the smallest we've been able to measure yet. So they can be suspended in the air for weeks. I guess our advice would be to use the ventilation system if you have it, and clean the filters as well.
3, 2, 1, fire!
About 5 years ago, we came across this toy that's a deformable elastic sphere that we started skipping on the water surface, just like stones, and we observed some really interesting phenomena, including this notion that the sphere skips really, really close to each other at the end of its travel. And so we looked more into the details of what's going on there, and we stumbled upon this water walking mechanism.
Water walking is this newly observed skipping state that we saw, where rather than skipping in a manner like a skipping stone, the sphere actually starts to rotate very quickly. It holds a deformed shape, and then it hits rapidly across the water surface. And if you see it, it really gives this impression that it's walking across the water surface like the basilisk lizard.
We have dug into the mathematics and the mechanics behind why this phenomenon occurs, and it turns out it's a naturally occurring state that the ball wants to be in if it's rotated fast enough. We went out to a place where one could study this, Bear Lake, and we had people in the water with high-speed cameras looking at what was happening 150 feet downrange.
I wish I could work every day like this, actually. Wake up early, watch a sunrise over a beautiful lake, work in a lovely lake, and then pack up by 2 o'clock and go home and rest.
The experiment that I'm looking at is the emergence of small scales in vortex ring collisions. So if you've ever seen someone blow a smoke ring, I'm looking at the exact same flow structure, except I take these 2 vortex rings and I fire them head-on into each other. And when they do that, they expand radially and then just rapidly break down into this turbulent cloud of smoke. Understanding turbulence is important because we live in turbulence. So we were very interested in the system because you have these nice ordered laminar flow structures that rapidly break down into fine-scale turbulence. We were able to show through some of our experiments by imaging the collision of these 2 vortex rings locally in 3 dimensions that we were actually able to see vortex cores. They do flatten into very thin vortex sheets, which then break down into 2 secondary vortex filaments, which themselves we have observed break down into even smaller tertiary filaments. And we're really working on probing this system and measuring how these small filaments emerge from large filaments in this mechanistic perspective and try to compare it with the theoretical model. If we can get a better understanding of how this occurs, we can have a better grip on how these turbulent flows are interacting with everyday life, because we don't live in a vacuum, you know.
I had a great spring break last year in Phoenix, Arizona, and we saw a great video there of these women in Vanuatu that make music by interacting with the water, by slapping and moving their hands through it. And that inspired us to study this phenomenon more closely.
The sound they make is a lot like a drum set. So they have a way of making like a snare drum and a bass drum and a cymbal. For instance, the snare drum is just slapping your hand on the surface and pulling it back up. And then a bass drum is when you plunge your hand all the way underwater and there's that collapsing event. So our experiment is a lot more calculated perhaps and like dry, but we essentially, have a high-speed camera there and hydrophone and a microphone, and we slap the surface or plunge in the surface and then record that. But it's not nearly as exciting as watching these women do it. It's a possibility you could communicate underwater this way from the surface. It's maybe a way that you could call your kids back if they were snorkeling or something like that. Slap, slap, plunge, plow. And it'd mean like, Jerry, get home now. I'm so angry at you. Something.